Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Karl Rove, Bret Stephens, and Geoff Cowan.
You know, Scott, I think what you said is true. This has become a remarkable event. It's become a national treasure. Jamie deserves so much credit for it. Helene deserves so much credit for it. We're not going to have the audience in a Q&A this year. I'm hoping that next year Helene's wonderful improvements of this room will make it so everybody can hear well during a Q&A. But it's a phenomenal event, and people cannot resist coming here. But one of the reasons it's been so great, honestly, is that I think 4 of the 5 years, Scott Berg has started us off. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. So I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation here with really two of the leading thinkers and political thinkers in the country, but also people who think much more broadly than about politics. Bret Stephens, those of you who were here last year, and my guess is many were, will remember that impassioned and beautiful and heartfelt and very personal speech that he gave, ripping up the address that he had in mind a year ago to talk about the events that were just starting with the beginning of a new administration. We'll get to that later, but Bret's here for the 4th time, and since that time, though, Bret's own world has changed a bit. When he was here last year, he was a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He's now a columnist for the New York Times, and I want to talk a bit about that. And he's now also a commentator for NBC, so please join me in welcoming the terrific Bret Stephens. And Karl Rove is really here. He's a rookie, and I don't know if there's any much else left for you to be a rookie in, Karl. Everybody here knows Karl Rove's name very well. You know him, of course, as a brilliant political strategist, too brilliant for my own particular side of the aisle, but brilliant. Seems to win most of the time. And he really was the architect of George W. Bush's presidential campaign, and then much of his presidency, playing crucial roles as senior advisor and a deputy chief of staff in the White House, and in some ways maybe the most important person. Steve Bannon tried to compete, but I think really Karl Rove was the most important person that's ever been in the White House in precisely that kind of role. And he still continues to be involved in politics with the Political Action Committee and so forth, but really he's here as an author. He writes for the Wall Street Journal. He's still with the Journal. And he wrote a wonderful book called The Triumph of William McKinley, and he's working on another book now. So for his first, but I hope not by any means his last visit to this wonderful festival, please join me in welcoming Karl Rove. Because we are a festival of writers and books, I want to start with a question of both of you about, and you both have seen it up so close, do books matter to people who become political leaders? Does it matter, and I don't want to yet focus on the current inhabitant of the White House. I want to think more broadly about it, because we should all think more broadly about these questions. Does it matter that a political leader reads, and what kind of things he reads? Maybe, Bret, you could start.
Well, it should matter. I mean, one of the things that worries me most about the United States today is the possibility that what we call literary culture in America may be passing, and that literature is a technology to convey a set of ideas and a world of information simply no longer has the grip on my children's generation than it had on mine, to say nothing of my parents. And so there's been a kind of a process in which political thinking has become just ever more superficial, it seems to me. I know this is, as you get older, you get crankier, and I guess I'm experiencing this for myself. But when you think of great political leaders, they were great readers. Abraham Lincoln said there's nothing like Macbeth. He hadn't read all of Shakespeare, but when you think of his particular political experience, bringing it through the filter of a play like Macbeth, to understand the nature of tyranny and the corruption of political power, that says something. Winston Churchill was not only a great reader, but he was a great writer. He won the Nobel Literature Prize. Funny, he never won the Nobel Peace Prize, which tells you everything about the Nobel Peace Prize. But he won the Nobel Literature Prize in 1953. One of the great delights for me as a young conservative, or as a conservative, was reading a collection of Ronald Reagan's letters that was put together long after he'd left the presidency. And of course, even in my memory of Reagan, Reagan was seen as the kind of, I think the phrase was the amiable dunce. But nobody can read those letters and not think that Reagan was well steeped in the political literature and the political battles of his time. And here was an articulate man who could compose not just grammatical sentences, but logical sequential paragraphs in order to draw on a kind of a philosophical well to make his arguments. And I know Karl can say the same things about George W. Bush. I think the most important thing is, and I say this not just simply for political leaders, but for everyone, what I worry about is conversations I have in many ways, I feel like I'm talking to people who, even if their IQs are high, even if they can process information quickly, their mental landscape reminds me of 14th century maps, where sort of the lay of the immediate landscape, Europe, for example, is identifiable, but then it becomes increasingly imaginary, and then it ends up with "there be dragons." And if you don't know in a sense, the intellectual geography, you can't connect dots. You don't know how things relate. And this is what I think we're really losing now. There's this increasingly oppressive presentism, if I think I'm coining a word, probably not, in our thinking, and that has to do with a hollowing out of literary culture. And that's why I think it's important, and why I think we should keep it going.
Reading minute to minute is Twitter or is a Facebook thing, you're less likely to be, even though you're reading a lot of words, it's all present. It's not part of a...
I mean, there should be a Twitter feed for haiku, but that gets me on a separate subject.
Karl, I want to in a minute, as you know, talk to you about what George W. Bush read, which a lot of people will be surprised to hear. But I want to just ask you the same question about, does it in general matter that political leaders read? Is that an important thing? And again, I'm not just talking about this president, whether it's the leader of Israel or of England or of Mexico or the Speaker of the House. Does it matter?
Yeah, very much so. I know we may have John Meacham here, so I hesitate to talk about Jefferson with Meacham in the room, but you read the letters of Madison and Jefferson to each other, and they're routinely talking about great classics of political thought, current and past, that they are reading or that they've read and illuminate some current problem. My view is that one, and this may sound overrated, but every president and political leaders ought to read, if for no other reason than relief. You know, particularly if you're president, you got a pretty damn difficult job. So to be able to read for release, whether it is something that has got bearing on what you're dealing with or not, is useful. But I also know that it's enormously valuable to be able to, your point about presentism. It is not so much important to read the book that is talking about the thing of the moment than to read something that may have been tested by time. I remember in the early days of 2001 and 2002, to get a handle on Islamic extremism, the works of Bernard Lewis were really important. Yeah. The great Princeton Middle Eastern expert, and these were very important to President Bush. But there are things of current value, of currency, that are valuable for a president to read, particularly if he's willing to read on both sides. For example, in the run-up to the decision about stem cell research, a great bioethicist at the University of Chicago gave the president several books on both that would basically make the arguments on both sides of the question. And it was enormously valuable. Remember, a president is reading all of the time. Most presidents are reading all the time. And what they're reading is lots of things from very smart people on the things of the moment. But it's always good to get a little bit of, to be able to step back a little bit and sort of draw from the springs that are well informed and tested by time.
So I think it comes as a surprise to certain people to know that George W. Bush was a reader. We were at a wonderful talk that he gave recently, and he was very cute when he said the first time he wrote a book, he said he thought people were shocked to know he'd ever read a book. Yeah. But in fact, could you talk a bit about the reading patterns of George W. Bush as president?
Well, first of all, I love it. He plays a good old boy from Midland, but he is a Yale history major and a Harvard MBA. And I remember when John Lewis Gaddis came to the White House for breakfast one time. This is the great historian of the Cold War era, taught at Yale. And I don't know, do we have a lot of Yaleys here? Okay, so at Yale, they set you up for contributing to the university by having class days. So the class of 56 and 66 and 76 will all be on campus, and they'll have somebody come and give you lectures, and they'll feed you and pick out the ones with big pocketbooks and schmooze you so that they can get a contribution from you. So they called upon Gaddis for 1 year that while Bush was in office, to speak at the the class day. So he got up and gave a talk on, the Cold War era and so forth and so on. And then took questions, and somebody said, "Hey, I understand you had George W. Bush in your class. Just how dumb was he?" And Gaddis says he was one of the most interesting minds I've ever had in any student. Read everything, remembered everything, worked everything through, and as a result, a joy to have in a classroom. And they booed him. And Gaddis was still shaky, literally, when he came to the White House mess several weeks later. It's literally like, I thought the guy said, then they booed me. And it's like, hey, welcome to academia.
But you had almost like a book club with him, didn't you?
Yeah. The president is a little quirky. So when he was during the holidays, he was generally during Christmas and New Year's down at the ranch in Crawford. And so if he was down there generally on Sunday afternoon, if we hadn't talked that day, he would call and just sort of catch up on the gossip. So the Sunday before New Year's 2005, he called and we had our normal conversation. And at the end of it, I could hear Laura in the background sort of saying something to him. He said, okay, I'll ask him. He says, Laura wants to know, do you have any good New Year's resolutions? And I said, yeah, I got one. I said, I've been sort of busy this year, but I'm a real big reader. And I said, which he knew. But I said, I've gotten out of the habit, so my goal is to read a book a week in 2006. And he said, okay, good, really, great, terrific, really nice. And when, sort of like, you're a complete nerd moron. And moved on. So this is on a Sunday. On Tuesday, we're sitting in the Oval Office. He came back Monday. Monday was New Year's, I think it was, or maybe it was Tuesday. But anyway, the day after New Year's, he came back, and we had a meeting at about 11:30, almost every day, 11:30, called the Daily Brief. And it was the president, the vice president, the national security advisor, the chief of staff, the senior advisor, and the counselor. And we would have met early in the day and would sort of get caught up. And we were waiting for the vice president to show up, and Bush turned to me and said, I'm on my second, where are you? He had finished reading Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals, on New Year's Day on the flight back to Washington. And so we started a contest. And in about a week or two, his secretary, who was keeping track of all of our respective reads, said, stop bothering me. She said, tell me when you finish your books, preferably by email, but don't bother me, and once a week I will release the standings. And so, we were reading, and, she was like, blah, and I could sort of detect something there, and so I knew where he was coming from. So on one particular day during the Daily Brief, we were talking about where the current standings were, and I said, Mr. President, I really think this is probably unfair to you because we don't take into consideration you may be reading bigger books with more pages in it. And so we ought to not just keep track of the books, but we also ought to keep track of the pages and the total linear area of the pages. He said, that sounds like a really good idea. We ought to do that. I said, great, I'm 11% ahead of you. So I dug it out. I actually wrote it in a Wall Street Journal column proving that no stupid thing is unworthy of a Wall Street Journal column. I beat him first year 110 to 95. I had 40,000 pages, he had 37,000. More importantly, I had 2,275, 431 total linear inches. Among the books that he read that year were biographies of Lincoln, Carnegie, Twain, Babe Ruth, King Leopold of Belgium, Whitney James Bryan, Huey Long, LBJ, and Genghis Khan. He read Andrew Roberts' History of the English-Speaking People since 1900, Manhunt about the search for Lincoln's killer, Philbrick's Mayflower. We started reading John MacDonald mysteries. Anybody, Travis McGee?
Yeah.
So we had to, by the end of the contest, you could only read a John MacDonald mystery because you can read them in about an hour and a half. You could only read one if he was reading one as well. And year two, we got into Shakespeare plays, and you could only read one Shakespeare play if the other guy was reading a Shakespeare play. Anyway, I creamed him. 110, 95. I won the trophy. It looked suspiciously like a bowling trophy. Wasn't enough. He came back a second year. Year two, we sort of both slowed down. I was 76. He was 51. He read The Great Upheaval and Khrushchev's Cold War, Dean Acheson, Andrew Mellon. Anyway, and he read the Bible every year too, and he had a devotional, and so he read the entire Bible each year. And I thought, look, you're rereading the same thing 1 year. You ought to let it sit out for a year, or we can not count it. And each year, I won 3 years in a row and retired the trophy. And his pathetic excuse each and every year was he was the leader of the free world. Really, seriously? I'm like the deputy chief of staff to the leader of the free world. So come on, man.
I want to keep on going on, but let me ask you one question here, Carl. You said, he played this role. It was true, but he was playing a role of being from Midland, Texas. Was this something he didn't really want people to know, that level of intelligence that he had?
He didn't care. I mean, he always thought it was sort of pretentious when Bill Clinton would, one of his favorite stories was Bill Clinton when he went with his dad to Indonesia and following the tsunami relief. 41 and 43, this is where they bonded, and 43 realized he must have had some illegitimate contact with a woman in the past and produced Bill Clinton as his missing son. Couldn't remember exactly how that happened, but he was sure it must have. So they're in Indonesia, and there's a thing called art and embassies. Rock Schnabel is here.
By the way, it was also started by Leonore Annenberg.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So art and embassies, where the work of American artists are displayed in our embassies abroad. And they're walking into the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta, and Bill is in front of 41, and 41 is talking to the ambassador, and the Charge d'Affaires is talking to Clinton, and they stop in front of this painting, and the Charge d'Affaires says, well, this is from Joe Shimoli, and this is from his blue period, and it's not different from his red period and his green period, and notice the use of the colors here, and these symbols mean this, and these shapes mean that, and this is one of his early works from the blue period. And they go in it, and they come back out, and as they're coming out, they stop in front of the same painting, and Clinton turns to 41 and says, this is from Joe Shimoli. He's one of my favorite artists. This is from his blue period, George. It's from his early work, his blue. I love the blue period. It's better, I think. It speaks more to my heart than the red period or the green period. And that's what these things here mean. Here, let me just tell you, he has no idea whatsoever that George 41 has heard every single word from the Charge d'Affaires and knows that all Clinton is doing is repeating it. Well, Bush 43, his attitude was, I don't need to prove to anybody that I'm a reader. I'm a reader. As long as I've known him, he's had an interesting book on the nightstand.
But I think the point that I want to conclude this segment is it's important that people read. And I think it's important for one other reason, which is it gives you empathy. You understand other people in other worlds, which you can really, I think, only do through that kind of reading. I want to talk about trends in the world with you for a minute, and maybe, Bret, I could start with you in this. Your colleague, Nick Kristof, wrote, who, of course, spends his life looking at the horrible things that are happening in the world. But he did a column the other day where he said, the best year ever for mankind was 2017. By the way, for people who wonder, the second best year for mankind was 2016, and probably the third best year was 2015. In other words, he was making the case that if we think of all of humanity, there are so many trends that are terrific in the world, but maybe some trends that aren't so good. I'm curious what you think. Are we living in the best of times, the worst of times, a combination? And if you could predict, and Scott's talk reminds us it's so darn hard to predict, but to the extent you can predict, where are we on the trends in the world?
Well, that was a very thought-provoking column. If you were, I'm thinking of Scott's talk, if you were living in 1913, you would say 1913 was the best year we've ever had. Prior to that, the best year was 1912. There were a series of conferences at the Mohonk Hotel in upstate New York that were presided over by Nicholas Murray Butler, the long-serving president of Colombia, in which Butler very confidently exclaims how the idea that the most civilized nations in the world, into which have been poured the glories of Western philosophy and Christian religion, could of a sudden fly at each other's throats to murder and maim and kill and destroy, was just an idea that was too ridiculous to contemplate. And of course, in July and then August of 1914, we entered into that world. And it's a reminder to me, in thinking about global politics, that trend is not truth. We tend to think there's a trend line, and that trend line is true until it's not. There was a trend line showing that Japan's economy was gradually overtaking America's, and then that collapsed. Currently, there's a trend line making the same argument about China, and there's never an end to these pompous reports from consulting firms about the world under Chinese hegemony or primacy, and so on, and we'll see. What concerns me, and I wrote a book about this in 2014, is that we are witnessing, it seems to me, the degradation and decline of what for most of our lives we called the liberal international world order, led by the United States and by a succession of presidents, Democrats as well as Republicans, who believed that the only way in which a decent world order could possibly be sustained was by a combination of American hard leadership, economic as well as military, but also American idealism, the idealism that Scott mentioned with Wilson, and the 14 points. One of the reasons I found the Trump presidency so distressing is that I don't think Trump yet understands that if you are going to lead the free world, you're going to have to give other countries and other people pretty good reasons to follow. And if you're going to have a mercantilist foreign policy, economic policy, if you're going to have a beggar thy neighbor trade policy, and if you are going to showcase a side of American character in your basic deportment as a president or the way you speak about other countries, it's simply going to be a lot more difficult to inspire the kind of affection that Harry Truman did with the Berlin airlift or Ronald Reagan did once again in Berlin at the Wall. in 1987. I think these trends began under President Obama when he started talking about nation building at home, which is an alluring but fundamentally foolish concept. And my fear is that they have accelerated under the current administration, even though in some senses, in some respects, there are aspects of what this president has done that I actually agree with. So that is my fear. John Maynard Keynes wrote a wonderful book. This is in the Economic Consequences of the Peace, but he talks about what life was like for a reasonably well-to-do Londoner in 1913. Passportless travel. Hold on, this is coming off. Passportless travel throughout Europe. Being able to use the telephone to get anything you need, a kind of an early Amazon of its day. And you read about this world, and it all comes apart very, very quickly. What Harry Truman understood, and which this president has to understand, is that we cannot turn our backs on the problems of the world and think that those problems won't pursue us. The world needs the bulwark of American power and American will, but we also need to sustain that with a set of ideals which are universal and which are consistently applied.
I think you both have read, I know you have, Bret, I don't know, Karl, if you've read Max Boot's piece in Foreign Policy, just out in the last couple of days, and maybe you talk in which he says it was unimaginable that the United States standing in the world would drop so dramatically and present some of the problems you're talking about. Max Boot, of course, himself, did he work in your administration? I think he did.
Advisor. Yeah.
Advisor, administration, Republican, basically conservative Republican, but so worried about this. How do you see this trend in terms of America in the world, and also the illiberal democracy risk?
Look, I read Christoph's piece. I think there's a lot of truth in it. And if you look at it, the world is getting wealthier. The percentage of the population living in complete abject poverty has been dropping pretty dramatically. There are all kinds of indicators that people are, by and large, in most places of the world, living longer and healthier. But I think Bret has picked up on the number one issue, which is this international order, which has been sort of a Pax Americana, is dissolving, in part because we were leading from behind, and now we're America first. Well, both of these things have run counter to the 60 years of success that we've had in building a world that is increasingly globalized, in which America is increasingly prosperous, and more people are living in democracy. And that's in America's interest. It's in America's interest to have more of the world be democratic, because democracies tend not to attack each other. They tend to respect and be responsive to the needs of their citizens. We want the world to be more prosperous. We don't want to be, we were 5% of this world population, 25% of the world's economy, and we're not going to be able to be a rich and prosperous country by taking in each other's laundry. And we can only be increasingly prosperous if our neighbors and our customers are increasingly prosperous. You can't have a prosperous country if you're out beggaring your neighbor. And part of this international framework has been one in which the rules have been known. What's wrong with NAFTA? I've yet to figure out, except that they're not buying as much from us, in the case of Mexico, as we buy from them. And Canada, when you take goods and services together, we buy less from them than they buy from us. So let's immediately take the service angle out of it so that we can feel aggrieved and tell them they got to buy more goods from us in order to even that relationship out. I mean, this is not helpful over the long haul to America. And the world needs American leadership. And I don't just simply mean in a military fashion or even in an economic fashion. I saw it up close. I think Rock was involved in this as well. Saw this up from close in the moral fashion. We go to our first meeting with Europe. Bush is concerned about AIDS in Africa. All of these meetings are programmed in advance. Each nation has a Sherpa, I think that's one of the coolest titles in government. You're a Sherpa because you're going to have a summit, so you have all the Sherpas talk. So the Europeans knew exactly where we were coming from. And Bush walks into the meeting and says, we're seeing the continent of Africa melt down under AIDS and malaria, and it is within our capacity as civilized democracies to solve that problem, and it's our obligation, our moral obligation to confront this. And so we want to have a massive effort to confront AIDS in Africa. And we'll put up half the money. And the French, led by the French, said, oh, monsieur, little man from Texas, thank you for coming. But we will have an international organization. We will put it in Geneva, which has excellent restaurants. And it will be the Global AIDS Fund, and we will, nice of you to suggest you will give half the money, but we will give every country in the world an allocation, and when we have 50% of the money raised, then we will begin to worry about the little people in Africa suffering from AIDS and malaria. We go back 1 year later. 2 countries in the world have met their obligation under the global AIDS, the United States of America and Finland. And Bush said, screw it. I'm going to go to Congress and ask for a very substantial sum of money, the President's Emergency Relief for AIDS and Malaria in Africa, PEPFAR, and if you want to help, come along. And when the United States did that, then and only then did the world wake up to what was happening in that continent and begin to support the effort to confront AIDS. But, you know, it was amazing to be at that meeting and see these countries wealthy, closer to the problem, more likely to be affected by the problem. An unstable Africa is going to be felt, and we've already seen it, would be felt quicker in Europe than it'd be felt in the United States. And yet there was a sort of a reluctance to get involved with confronting something that was easy for us to confront if we had a will to do it, and we did it.
I think of the things that President Bush did, perhaps that's the one he's proudest of, and saved something like 14 million lives.
I was in the Delta of Nigeria not too long ago, and this guy comes up to me at a conference. Guy comes up to me and says, I am a governor of one of the regions in the Delta of Nigeria. Do you know what the most popular names for young boys and girls in my region is? I said, I have no idea. He said, George and Laura. And Bush now goes there every year. Nobody knows about this, or very few people know about it. He goes to Africa every year for a week, goes someplace in Africa, and does things like spends the week at an AIDS clinic in Rwanda doing carpentry work and painting.
And of course, his daughter created a health program.
Yeah, and worked for half a year in an AIDS hospice in South Africa as the program was ramping up.
So, having had this conversation about Bush, and I want to switch to some other things in a second, I'm sure it did not go unnoticed by you that a poll came out this week that showed that when he left office, George W. Bush was about 32% favorable and 60% unfavorable. I believe the current poll is the reverse of that.
61 favorable. Not that anybody's paying attention.
So Karl, could you explain your view of what's happened?
You know, look, people make a harsh judgment. We're in a war. We're in an unpopular war, and people were looking at it in terms of that and not the broader picture. And now they've had a chance to look at the broader picture, and people recognize the decision to double down and send more troops in the surge was the right decision. They know now that President Obama was correct when he said in 2012, Iraq is largely democratic and secure and at peace with its neighbors and a success. And then blew it by withdrawing all U.S. troops. So I think, look, this may surprise you, but I'm a little bit of a hothead. So, you know, I had a little device on my desk that showed me the president's whereabouts at any time, and I had, along with several others, standing instruction when the device went off and showed that he was making the move from the White House and that long commute across the South Lawn with Barney the dog to the Oval Office, that I should wander by the Oval Office to get the morning orders. And so I would have gotten in at 6. This would be about 6:30, 6:35, 6:40. And I would have read the New York Times, with all due respect to Bret, whose columns I love. Incidentally, you must buy America in Retreat, Bret Stephens. Available on Amazon.com. I brought my copy to be personally autographed tonight, and you too, if you go out and rush and get one, can tomorrow or the next day get a personal autographed copy, as long as you purchase it, by Bret Stephens. Anyway, so I would have read some New York Times editorial and be, steam coming out of my ears, and I'd walk in and the president would say, what's going on? What's happened last night? What's going on this morning? I'd say, well, the New York Times has a stupid editorial and stupid idiots at the New York Times, blah, 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 blah.
It's gotten better.
Yeah, it has. It has. Twice a week, it's gotten better. Well, actually 3, because Pete Wehner writes now. And so Bush would laugh it off and he'd say, history will get it right and we'll both be dead. Which is a very healthy
Of course,
attitude.
we don't know what history will be, and that's one thing that's so interesting. We're constantly reinterpreting history, and when pundits say, oh, history will say this or history will say that, the truth is we don't really know. But Bret, you've made a judgment. You wrote, as of this point, you wrote a column a couple of weeks ago in which you said at least where you stand today with regard to this president. And maybe you could sort of talk about that, because you talked about a whole series of things where you agree with him, but you say you still would have voted for Hillary.
Yeah. I'm always endearing myself with both sides. I'm happy Neil Gorsuch is on the Supreme Court. I am delighted that we are moving the United States Embassy to Jerusalem. I think Trump took the right decision in adding troops in Afghanistan. I think a corporate tax cut that is already resulting in the repatriation of billions of dollars to the United States is great. On a whole list of policies, I'm actually reasonably happy with the administration. Problem is that presidents don't simply inaugurate or execute policy. Presidents also inaugurate and create political cultures. And if you're a conservative, you believe that at the end of the day, culture is what determines the success of a society. In a republic like ours, small r republic, part of that culture is the culture of governance, expectations that we have of our political leaders, the character of those leaders, and how that reflects the government, and the general sense of trust in institutions that are essential to the preservation of a democracy like a free press. And I can't find, when I look at that side of the equation, a whole lot of redeeming features to this presidency. I mean, some of you who like the presidency are probably saying, yeah, but we're getting these tax cuts and we're getting this good policy, and isn't that great? But sooner or later, Elizabeth Warren is going to be president, or Kamala Harris or whoever, okay? It will happen. To those of you who are Republicans in this audience, I will make one good prediction. There will be a Democrat in the White House who will overturn most of the policy achievements that at least I like. And what will stay is a political culture that I think has been degraded. I think it is terrible when the President of the United States attacks the integrity of the FBI, when he calls into question the patriotism of the CIA. I remember 20 years ago when I started out at the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, we were not happy that the President of the United States was not only having a dalliance with an intern in the White House, but then he was lying about it under oath. And I find it amazing among conservatives what total comfort lots of conservatives seem to have with a report in the Wall Street Journal that the President of the United States, through a lawyer, through an LLC, paid a porn actress $130,000 to keep quiet about their affair. Now, if that had been, ask yourselves honestly, if that had been a Democrat in the White House, John Edwards, let's say, okay, about whom that was alleged, would the Republicans in this audience just be shrugging and saying, the man's a character, you know?
And we're about to have to end this, but Karl, we were talking for a few minutes about a statement that was made yesterday by Tony Perkins, the head of the family, what's it called, this organization? Family Research Council, which is a big moralistic group, so-called, and he said, well, let's give him a mulligan on that one because we like other things.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Karl, could you give, not to end on a downer, we'll try to end on an upper, But could you give your analysis of where we are a year into this
Yeah.
administration?
Yeah, look, I agree with a lot of what Bret says. I too like the policy agenda, and I think damage to that policy agenda is being done by a president who seems to can't get between himself and success. He keeps getting between himself and success, and it is the behavior. It's the incessant tweeting which degrades the office. I mean, frankly, he keeps punching down. You know, Meryl Streep, is that a worthy opponent of the President of the United States for a 140-character tweet that she's a lousy actress? And he's getting himself into trouble by this whole issue of fake news because the President routinely says things that are not accurate. And it's corrosive. Having said that, let me try and end on an upbeat note. We've been here before. We've been screwed up before. Things have been, and he's not the first one to engage in behavior that has upset me or upset a lot of people. But we always have in our system a sort of an instinct for correction. You know, we have 3 lousy presidents in a row. The country is going to hell in a handbasket. It's about ready to split apart at the seams. And with 40% of the vote, we send a lanky lawyer from Sangamon County, Illinois, to be president. You know, we're on the eve of World War II. Europe is in flames. We get the Selective Service Act by 1 vote in the U.S. Congress. We get Lend-Lease by a complete subterfuge on the part of the President of the United States, who basically misleads Congress as to what this does and what he's going to do with it. And as a result, we're prepared to fight and win World War II in 4 years. And my McKinley book, you think politics today is screwed up? Go back to the Gilded Age. We have 5 presidential elections in a row in which not a single president gets 50% of the vote. 2 of the presidents in that era lose the popular vote but win the Electoral College. And a 3rd president wins both the Electoral College and the popular vote. But his popular vote nationwide is less than 10,000 votes. We have 2 years with Republican president, Senate, and the House, 2 years with a Democratic president, Senate, and the House, and 20 years of divided government in which nothing gets done, not only because the 2 parties are intensely partisan and have deeply differing views of what ought to happen to the future of the country, but they are still fighting the Civil War. In 1874, when the Democrats take control of the House for the first time in 18 years, it's called the Victory of the Brigadiers, because so many former Confederate officers are elected to the Congress. There is no election after 1868 in which there is not widespread violence, including murder, aimed at driving down the votes of black Republicans in the South. In 1896, there are 3 states in the South in which a majority of men over the age of 21 are black, and they're overwhelmingly Republican, and the best that William McKinley can do in any one of those states is 25% of the vote. And I'm reading the congressional record, 1884, dry debate on protection and free trade. And at the end of the debate, the Republicans have scored a political triumph over the Democrats by the use of some very adroit management by a mild-mannered congressman from Ohio named William McKinley. And one Democrat gets up to excoriate his colleagues on this, and he's taking one particular member and kicking the crap out of him. And the member stands up and says, "Mr. Speaker, he's violating the decorum of the House." The Speaker says, the honorable gentleman from wherever is out of order, you must restrain yourself. And he turns to his colleague and says, "I would not blank you if you were a dog." Now, it's 4 letters, and they're ellipsed, but I can sort of figure out what he just said. And you think it's bad now with them shutting down the Congress? In 1888, the Republicans take control of the House, and when they sit down to seat in 1891, the Democrats say they will not allow a single bill to be brought up on the floor of the House of Representatives. They will refuse to answer the roll call and thereby deny the House a quorum to pass a single bill. Now, this is not, you got to give us DACA or we're going to shut down the government, or you got to repeal Obamacare or we're going to shut down this government. It is, we don't care what the crap it is you want to do. We're not answering the roll call. This goes on for 2.5 months. Until the Speaker of the House, Thomas Brackett Reed of Maine, 6 foot 3 inches tall, 300 pounds, looks like a bowling pin with a walrus mustache painted on him, smart, tough, and really competent, says, okay, we've had enough of this. And at the end of a roll call, he says, the chair directs the clerk to show Mr. Jones present, Mr. Smith present, calls out the name of every Democrat present on the floor who's refused to answer the roll call. All hell breaks loose. Every Democrat tries to run out of the chamber of the House of Representatives. But he has marshals, sergeants at arms in front of every single door and has literally blockaded the doors, barred them on the outside. One Democrat makes good his escape. Constantine August of Rusk County, Texas, who beats the crap out of the sergeant at arms and uses his cowboy boots to kick the door slats out and make good his escape. One Democrat stands up and says, under God and the Constitution, you have no authority to count me present without my permission. To which Reed says, the chair is merely stating a fact. Does the honorable gentleman from Kentucky deny he's present on the floor of the House? This goes on for 2 more months of debate during which not a single bill is passed by the U.S. House of Representatives and is ultimately answered in the U.S. Supreme Court. The opening day of the debate, another Texan makes a contribution to the debate. William Henry Hattie Martin of Athens, 6 foot 6 inches tall, thin as a rail, mean as a snake. He stands up, points at the speaker, and says to his fellow Democrats, if any member will order me to remove this dictator from his position of power upon the podium, I will do so by force forthwith. Reed says, the honorable gentleman from Texas is out of order. Martin is so pissed off. The next day, at the beginning of the day's debate, he takes a seat in the front row, pulls out his 16-inch-long Bowie knife, and spends the entire day sharpening it on his boot sole in an attempt to menace the Speaker of the House. Now, I don't remember Nancy Pelosi doing that with her stilettos in 2010.
All right, so I want to know, who here wants to take Karl Rove's history course? And by the way, when he was reading all those books with George W. Bush, don't you feel that made him feel a lot better during the dark days of the Bush administration? Bret, some last words from you to make us cheer us all up.
Well,
If
look,
it's not a Bowie knife.
it's not, I mean, I would say instead of going back over a century in the past, let's imagine that we go forward about a century. If we're in the year 2118 and we're asking ourselves what the great technological revolutions or economic innovations that define the terms of the 21st century, the way the Model T or the Wright Flyer define the terms of the 20th, or the locomotive, the steam engine of the 19th, what would people say? My guess is they would say, number one, fracking. We thought we were living in an energy of peak oil, and yet it turns out we're not only living in an energy of superabundance, but most of it is right here in North America, making us less dependent on Venezuelans, Iranians, and other unstable places. Number two, I would think mobile apps. Thanks to your iPhone, thanks to Steve Jobs, we have created an ecosystem, an economic ecosystem, which has completely disrupted all kinds of things we used to take for granted, like crappy cab companies, or any number of things are suddenly being disrupted because of this thing called mobile apps, which 10 years ago not one of you in this room had even heard of, and now it's a $100 billion industry. And the third thing I would say is immunotherapies. It used to be 100 years ago that you would die of an infectious disease, likely. 50 years ago, you die of a heart attack. Now you're dying of cancer. Thanks to immunotherapies and the possibility that we may conquer so many of these cancers in a way we simply hadn't anticipated just 4 or 5 years ago, you get to live well past 100 so you can die of dementia, which is fantastic. But
you will be happy, though. You will be happy.
But consider this. If you have a reasonable expectation that you're going to live to 100, you're going to be less tempted to retire at 60. You're going to get a new degree when you're 50, and you're going to have a second career, and that's going to solve our entitlements problem. And I think one of the things that will be noted 100 years ago is that each of these inventions came about in a specific place, which was the United States, and they came about in a period of deep national self-doubt and political dysfunction. And it's a reminder that Americans tend to be better than our politics are, as well as a reminder that what's glorious in America, what's the things that are happening in this country that are really interesting are the things very few of us have yet seen. It's the unseen in America that provides the sources of our renewal and redemption, and it's what makes me, despite everything, optimistic for the future.
And 100 years from now, we will still be celebrating this wonderful event, Jamie, that you created with civil discourse by terrific guests. Thanks so much.